Jim was in the middle of watching the sunset from a Malibu balcony when he pulled the $12,000 Rolex off his wrist and hurled it into the crashing Pacific waves below. What happened next left 43 people at that beach party completely speechless. August 14, 1969. The house belonged to a producer who'd just finished mixing LA Woman sessions. The party had been going since noon. Champagne, whiskey, smoke thick enough to taste. Earlier that night, someone had played Light My Fire, then Love Me 2 times, then the end on repeat. Jim had been drinking since dawn, his leather jacket soaked with salt air and sweat. But what none of them knew was that a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell had been standing in the darkness of the beach below, her pockets full of pills. Sarah had driven from Sacramento that morning, run away, broken home, her father's belt, her mother's silence. She had less than an hour before she'd planned to walk into the ocean and never come back. The Doors were the only music that made her feel anything anymore. Then she watched this drunk stranger on the balcony throw away a watch worth more than her father made in a year. She heard him shout down to the waves, "Time is the only prison that matters." If you want to hear more untold stories about Jim Morrison and the Doors, hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the moments that changed rock history forever. Sarah stood frozen in the sand as the Rolex disappeared beneath the foam. She'd been clutching the pill bottle so hard her palm was bleeding. Above her, the balcony had erupted into chaos. People screaming at Jim, someone trying to climb down the rocks to retrieve the watch, a woman sobbing. But Jim just stood there, gripping the railing, staring at the horizon like he was watching his own funeral. 3 hours earlier, he'd been in that same producer's bedroom with Pamela Courson, and the fight that exploded between them had torn something fundamental loose inside him. Pamela had flown in from Paris unexpectedly, walked into the house, and found Jim with his arm around a blonde actress whose name he couldn't even remember. The actress left quickly. Pamela stayed. What followed wasn't just another argument about infidelity or jealousy. It was something darker, something that had been building since the Miami incident 5 months earlier, when Jim had been charged with indecent exposure and profanity. Pamela had screamed that he was destroying himself, that the leather pants and the alcohol and the reckless performances were turning him into a cartoon, a product, a thing to be consumed. She'd grabbed his wrist, felt the weight of the Rolex, a gift from the label after Light My Fire hit #1, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. "You've become exactly what you said you'd never be. You're a brand now, Jim. Not a poet. A brand." He'd walked out of that bedroom and straight to the bar, where he'd consumed an entire bottle of Jim Beam in 40 minutes. The producer had tried to calm him down, talking about upcoming tour dates and album sales, and how they needed to capitalize on the Miami publicity. And that's when something inside Jim Morrison shattered completely. He walked to the balcony, looked down at the Pacific, the same ocean he'd grown up near as a Navy brat, the same water that represented everything his admiral father had stood for, discipline and order and time schedules. And he made a decision. The Rolex was heavy on his wrist, heavier than it had ever felt before. It had become a symbol of everything he despised, everything that was suffocating the poet he'd once been at UCLA, writing verse in notebooks and reading Rimbaud and Nietzsche until dawn. Now he was a commodity with a price tag, playing the same songs every night for crowds who wanted the Lizard King performance, not the truth. The watch had to go. It had to disappear into the same abyss he felt himself falling into. Sarah watched him throw it, and something clicked in her brain. This man, whoever he was, had just rejected everything her father had taught her to worship: money, status, material proof of worth. She'd grown up in a house where her father measured love in dollars, where Christmas meant expensive gifts wrapped in obligation, where her mother's diamond ring had cost more than therapy ever could have. She'd stolen her father's emergency cash to buy this bottle of pills, planning to use his own currency to purchase her exit from his world. But this stranger on the balcony had just declared that none of it mattered. Time is the only prison. She pulled the pill bottle from her pocket, looked at it in the moonlight, and made her own decision. The bottle joined the Rolex somewhere beneath the waves. What Sarah didn't know was that the moment on that balcony was the culmination of a crisis that had been destroying Jim Morrison for months. After Miami, he'd become a legal target, facing up to 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The trial was scheduled for December. His bail conditions meant he couldn't leave the country, couldn't escape to the European literary world he'd been fantasizing about since college. He was trapped in America, trapped in his own fame, trapped in a relationship with Pamela that oscillated between desperate love and mutual destruction. She'd started using heroin more frequently. He'd been drinking whiskey for breakfast. They'd talked about death constantly, making a pact that if one died, the other would inherit everything. A romantic notion that felt less like love and more like a suicide agreement. The Rolex represented all of it. The success that had imprisoned him, the time he felt running out, the material world that had replaced his spiritual ambitions. 3 weeks before that Malibu party, he'd told Ray Manzarek that he wanted to quit music entirely, move to Paris, become a full-time poet. Ray had laughed, thinking it was the alcohol talking. It wasn't. Up on the balcony, the producer was furious. That watch had been insured, but that wasn't the point. Jim had just made a scene in front of industry people, investors, journalists. This would be in the trades by morning. Jim Morrison throws tantrum, destroys expensive gift, acts erratically at private party. More evidence for the prosecution's case that he was unhinged, dangerous, corrupting American youth. The producer grabbed Jim's shoulder, demanding an explanation. Jim turned to him with eyes that had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the party and the house and the California coastline. He said something that nobody else heard clearly, but the producer would repeat it years later in interviews. I just gave myself back an hour, maybe a whole lifetime. Down on the beach, Sarah was climbing back up toward the road where she'd parked her mother's stolen car. Her hands were empty now. No pills, no plan, just the strange lightness that comes from witnessing someone else's rebellion and recognizing your own possibility in it. She didn't know who the man on the balcony was. She'd find out 2 days later when she walked into a record store in Venice Beach and saw his face on a Doors poster. By then, she'd already called her younger sister Emma from a payphone, told her she was coming home, asked if their grandmother in Portland would let them both stay there for a while. Emma had cried with relief. Their mother had filed a missing person report. Their father had threatened to have Sarah arrested. None of that mattered anymore, because Sarah had seen someone choose nothing over everything, and it had rewired something fundamental in her understanding of survival. The party continued for hours after the Rolex incident, but Jim had disappeared. He'd walked down to the beach alone, sat in the sand near where Sarah had been standing, and watched the waves erase the evidence of his gesture. Pamela found him there around midnight. She sat beside him without speaking for nearly 20 minutes, and when she finally did talk, her voice was different, softer, more honest than it had been in months. She told him she understood why he'd thrown the watch. She told him she was scared they were both dying, just in slow motion, killing themselves in hotel rooms and recording studios and beds that never felt like home. She told him she wanted to leave Los Angeles too, wanted to find something real again before the drugs and the fame and the chaos consumed what was left of them. Jim put his head on her shoulder and cried, which was something only Pamela ever saw him do. They made plans that night to move to Paris together, to leave America and the Doors and the legal troubles behind. It would take 2 years to actually happen, and by then, It would be too late for both of them. But in that moment, sitting on the Malibu beach with the Pacific erasing the day's evidence, they believed escape was possible. They believed time wasn't a prison after all, just a locked door they hadn't figured out how to open yet. The Rolex was gone. The pills were gone. The sun would rise in 6 hours, and none of them would remember exactly how the night had felt, only that something had shifted. Something had been thrown away that couldn't be retrieved. For Jim, it was the beginning of his final spiral toward Paris and the bathtub where he'd be found dead less than 2 years later. For Pamela, it was the continuation of an addiction that would kill her 3 years after Jim, also at 27. For Sarah, it was the moment she chose life, the moment a stranger's gesture of defiance became her own permission to survive. She'd write Jim a letter in 1971 after hearing about his death, but she never mailed it. She kept it in a drawer for 40 years until her daughter found it while cleaning out Sarah's apartment after she passed away from natural causes at 68. The letter said, "You saved my life on a beach in Malibu, and you never knew it. I hope someone saved yours. I hope you found the freedom you were looking for when you threw that watch away." Nobody did save Jim Morrison. He found his freedom the only way he seemed able to, through disappearance, through becoming a myth, through dying young enough that the prison of time could never finish its work on him. The Rolex stayed at the bottom of the Pacific, probably corroded and unrecognizable within months, just another piece of expensive trash in an ocean full of human waste. But its absence on Jim's wrist for those final 2 years meant something to him. He never wore another watch. He stopped carrying identification. He let his hair grow long and his beard grow wild. He tried to erase the Lizard King and find Jim Morrison, the poet, underneath, but the damage was already done. The brand Pamela had accused him of becoming had fused to his skin like the leather pants he couldn't take off even when they caused infections. The party that night in Malibu was one of the last times Jim appeared in public in Los Angeles. He'd retreat to recording studios, dive bars, and eventually Paris, always running from the prison of time, never quite fast enough. Sarah Mitchell went on to become a social worker specializing in suicide prevention. She never told anyone the specific story of that night until she was interviewed for a documentary about teenage runaways in 2005. The filmmaker asked her what had changed her mind on the beach, and she'd struggled to explain it without sounding mystical or insane. How do you tell someone that watching a stranger throw away something valuable gave you permission to value your own life? How do you quantify the moment when someone else's rejection of materialism becomes your acceptance of existence? She settled on, "I saw someone choose to be free, even if just for a second. It made me want more seconds." Jim Morrison threw away $12,000 worth of watch because Pamela Courson told him he'd become a brand. Sarah Mitchell threw away a bottle of pills because Jim Morrison showed her that rebellion doesn't have to mean self-destruction. 2 acts of defiance, both aimed at the same prison, both thrown into the same ocean. One led to death. One led to 43 more years of life. The difference wasn't in the gesture, it was in what came after, when the water settled and the night ended, and the dawn forced everyone to make their next choice. Jim chose Paris and poetry and the bathtub. Sarah chose Portland and her sister and the long work of healing. The Rolex is still down there somewhere, if it even exists anymore. A rusted reminder that time wasn't the only prison that mattered. The real prison was believing that throwing something away meant you were finally free.